There is a silence that sounds peaceful from a distance. No conversations, no notifications, no expectations. Just you and the quiet. For a while, it feels like freedom, a chance to finally escape the endless noise of the world. But what if that silence never ended? What if days became weeks, and weeks became months without another human voice? Most people imagine they would simply feel lonely. But loneliness is only the surface. Beneath it, something far more remarkable begins to unfold. Because long before you notice the change, your brain already has. And the truth is, your brain was never meant to be alone. It is easy to think of the brain as a machine built for logic, for solving problems, for remembering names, or making decisions. But for most of human history, its greatest challenge was something much simpler: other people. Thousands of years ago, survival rarely depended on strength alone. It depended on belonging. Someone watched for danger while others slept. Someone shared food after a successful hunt. Someone noticed when a child wandered too far. To lose the group was often to lose your greatest chance of survival. Over countless generations, the human brain adapted to this reality. Connection was not treated as a luxury. It became part of the brain's survival system. Even though our cities have changed, our technology has changed, and our lifestyles have changed, that ancient wiring remains remarkably familiar. Even when you're sitting alone, your brain is rarely alone. Without realizing it, it is constantly searching. A familiar face, a passing conversation, footsteps in the hallway, the expression hidden behind someone's smile. Human beings are astonishingly skilled at reading one another. We notice tiny changes in tone, a brief hesitation, a raised eyebrow, a glance that lasts just a little too long. These moments seem ordinary, yet they quietly shape how the brain understands the world. Some neuroscientists suggest that one reason the human brain became so sophisticated was not only to understand nature, but to understand each other. Every conversation, every shared laugh, every meaningful glance becomes part of an invisible exercise that keeps these social networks active. So what happens when that exercise suddenly disappears? The brain doesn't stop adapting. It begins adapting to a different reality. The first days alone rarely feel dramatic. In fact, many people enjoy them. There is finally time to think, to read, to rest, to breathe without interruption. Healthy solitude has always been valuable. It offers space for reflection, creativity, and self-understanding. But complete isolation is something different. As the days pass, the absence of meaningful human contact slowly becomes information. Information your brain cannot ignore. Stress becomes easier to trigger. Sleep may become lighter. Small concerns begin feeling larger than they once did. Not because the world has suddenly become more dangerous, but because your brain has begun asking an ancient question: where is everyone? When we're hungry, our bodies remind us to eat. When we're thirsty, they remind us to drink. And when we lack meaningful connection, our minds begin sending signals as well, not to punish us, but to protect us. Because throughout human history, finding your way back to other people often meant finding your way back to safety. That raises a question few of us ever stop to consider. If the brain depends so deeply on connection, what begins to happen when that connection disappears completely? Imagine walking through a forest. You hear a branch snap behind you. Your heart beats a little faster. Your senses sharpen. You look for danger. Now imagine feeling a quieter version of that every single day. Without meaningful social contact, the brain can gradually become more alert to potential threats. Not because danger is everywhere, but because throughout human history, being alone often meant being more vulnerable. This doesn't happen overnight. It develops so slowly that most people never notice it. The world hasn't changed, but the way the brain interprets the world begins to shift. Our minds were never designed to exist in complete silence. When conversation disappears, the brain doesn't simply become quiet. Instead, it often begins creating conversations of its own. You replay old memories. You imagine future arguments. You wonder what someone meant by a sentence spoken months ago. You invent scenarios that may never happen. This isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's one of the brain's attempts to stay socially engaged, even when no one is there. The same remarkable imagination that allows us to dream, to create, and to plan for the future can also become trapped inside endless loops of thought. Without new conversations to interrupt those loops, they often grow louder. One of the most surprising changes isn't what happens inside the brain, but how the brain begins seeing everything around it. When meaningful social connection becomes scarce, people can become more sensitive to signs of rejection. A delayed reply suddenly feels personal. A stranger's neutral expression seems unfriendly. Silence begins to carry meanings that may never have existed. The brain is constantly trying to predict the intentions of others. When it doesn't have enough real information, it sometimes fills in the gaps, not with certainty, but with assumptions. This isn't because isolated people become irrational. It's because the brain dislikes uncertainty, and when certainty is unavailable, it prefers creating an explanation rather than having none at all. The brain does not separate emotions from biology. The two are deeply connected. Periods of prolonged isolation can place extra strain on the body's stress response. Over time, that can make it harder to concentrate, harder to regulate emotions, harder to recover after difficult experiences. This doesn't mean every person who spends time alone will experience these changes. People are different. Healthy solitude can be deeply restorative. The important difference is choice. Choosing to spend time alone is not the same as being cut off from meaningful human connection. One creates space for reflection. The other can gradually create a sense of emotional deprivation. The brain knows the difference, even when we struggle to describe it. Perhaps the greatest paradox of modern life is that a person can be surrounded by millions of others and still feel profoundly alone. Connection is no longer measured by distance. It is measured by depth. 100 conversations cannot replace one genuine understanding, and that leads to an even deeper question. If the brain needs more than simply being around people, what kind of connection was it truly designed for? There is a difference between being alone and feeling alone. One is measured by physical distance, the other by emotional connection. A person can spend an afternoon hiking through a quiet forest and return feeling deeply refreshed. Another can spend the entire day surrounded by coworkers, friends, or even family, yet still carry the weight of loneliness, because the brain isn't simply counting the number of people around us. It is asking a different question. Am I understood? Am I safe? Do I belong? These questions have echoed through the human story for thousands of years, and perhaps they always will. If connection feels so essential, it's because for most of our history, it was. Our ancestors survived not by becoming the strongest individuals, but by becoming remarkably cooperative. Knowledge was shared, food was shared, stories were shared, even grief was shared. Each generation passed something to the next, not only through language, but through relationships. Perhaps this is why isolation feels so unnatural. The brain still carries echoes of a world where another person's presence often meant protection, comfort, and hope. The modern world has changed faster than evolution ever could. Our surroundings are different, but the brain continues to speak an ancient language. Yet this does not mean we should fear being alone. In fact, some of humanity's greatest ideas were born in moments of solitude. Artists, writers, scientists, philosophers, many stepped away from the noise not to escape people, but to better understand themselves. Healthy solitude creates clarity. Isolation removes connection. One allows the mind to rest. The other slowly convinces the mind that it has been forgotten. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. Perhaps the goal isn't to avoid being alone. Perhaps the goal is to make sure that when we return,
there is still someone waiting to truly know us.
The human brain is one of the most extraordinary creations in nature. It can imagine worlds that do not exist, solve impossible problems, create music, art, and ideas that outlive generations. Yet beneath all of that complexity, it still longs for something profoundly simple: to be seen, to be heard, to know that another mind understands its own.
Perhaps that is why isolation changes us, not because the brain is fragile,
But because it was shaped by millions of years of shared existence. The need for connection is not a flaw, it is part of what made us human. So if you find yourself craving a meaningful conversation, reaching out to an old friend, or simply sitting beside someone you trust, remember this: your brain isn't asking for perfection. It isn't asking for popularity. It is asking for what it has always needed: a reminder that it was never meant to face the world entirely alone.